The quiet little girl probably doesn't even have the spine for emergency medicine. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before a 6.8 magnitude earthquake turned St. Michael's Hospital in Portland into a battlefield. Nobody knew it yet. Nobody except Katie Rodriguez, who was standing 3 feet away, checking the IV drip on a post-op patient in the ICU, her hand steady as surgical steel, her face unreadable. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous frequency overhead. It was 11:04 p.m. on a Tuesday. In exactly 48 minutes, everything would change. Katie had been at St. Michael's for 6 months. 6 months of 12-hour night shifts, 6 months of methodical charting, 6 months of going unnoticed except by the wrong person. She moved through the ICU with a precision that belonged to someone trained under fire, not someone fresh out of nursing school. Her documentation was immaculate, 3 screens per patient, every medication cross-referenced, every equipment code verified against actual procedures performed. She caught discrepancies the way a sniper detects movement in a crowd. Most nurses didn't notice. Most nurses didn't care. Dr. James Whitfield cared. He cared the way a man cares when someone threatens to expose what he spent a decade building. The chief of surgery was a tall man in his 50s, the kind of handsome that came with an expensive watch and a country club membership. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, all low power and implied threat. He wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, and St. Michael's Hospital had learned not to question him. 14 board members reported to him. A nursing director answered to him. 3 attending physicians deferred to him. And every single billing code that moved through the hospital's system passed through a filter he controlled. The phantom procedures started small. A $4,500 surgical kit listed for a case that never happened. Equipment charges doubled on paperwork while the actual devices sat in storage. Over 18 months, the scheme had generated $2.3 million in fraudulent claims against insurance companies and Medicare. Whitfield moved the money through a clinic network in Eugene and Sacramento. 3 times a year, he flew to Cabo. Nobody asked questions. Until Katie Rodriguez started asking them. She didn't ask loudly. That wasn't her way. A Master Chief Petty Officer didn't make waves over billing codes, not to civilians, not to anyone who might report her name up a chain of command that didn't exist anymore, not when she was supposed to be invisible. But her training made it impossible to ignore a breach in protocol, and these billing codes were breaches. Captain Marcus Chen, recovering in ICU room from shrapnel wound sustained at Bagram Air Base in Loga Province, had been charged for 2 orthopedic surgeries he never received. His chart showed a 3rd procedure, spinal fusion, that Katie knew for a fact never happened. She'd been present for all of Chen's actual procedures. She'd prepped his chest wound, monitored his oxygen saturation, changed his dressings. The charges were phantom. The equipment listed was phantom. The procedures were phantom. And Katie had noted this quietly in her charting, had asked her questions of the billing department in the tone she'd perfected over 12 years and 3 deployments, the tone that said, "I need clarification on these codes." Dr. Whitfield received her inquiry at 8:36 p.m. on a Tuesday. By 10:15 p.m., he had scheduled grand rounds for the following morning. By 11:04 p.m., he had positioned himself in the ICU hallway where he could watch her work, his presence a weight that pressed against the air itself like a predator marking territory. Katie felt his attention the way soldiers feel a sniper's scope, not as fear, but as information. Data. Pain was data. A threatening presence was data. She continued her rounds without breaking rhythm, her fingers moving through the familiar choreography of hospital work, checking for ports, verifying medication labels, adjusting vital signs monitors, noting the quiet beep of oxygen saturation climbing on a patient recovering from surgery. The 2 older nurses found her at the vending machine on the 2nd floor at 11:23 p.m. Carol and Margaret, both RNs with 15 years at St. Michael's, both perfectly comfortable with the way things worked and the way things stayed quiet. They approached with the casual cruelty of people who'd long ago decided Katie didn't belong. Carol spoke loud enough for the hallway to hear. "So Rodriguez, how many procedures have you actually assisted with?" Because administration is saying they need to do a competency review. Margaret laughed, a sharp, bright sound that echoed off the linoleum. The quiet little girl probably doesn't even have the spine for emergency medicine. You know how fast things move in a real ER? Not like this ICU babysitting. Katie inserted a dollar bill into the machine. The mechanical whir of the coil turning sounded like the loading mechanism of a rifle. She said nothing. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders remained level. She watched the vending machine descend with the patience of someone who had waited for mortar fire to pass, who had held a fellow sailor's severed femoral artery together with her bare hands for 40 minutes under sustained enemy contact. The granola bar dropped. She retrieved it. She turned to leave. That's when she saw Dr. Whitfield watching from his office doorway 20 feet away, his expression approving, his mouth curved in the faintest smile. He was watching the two nurses deliver what he'd orchestrated, measuring Katie's reaction like a scientist observing a specimen. His composure was absolute. His confidence was not. Katie moved past them without meeting their eyes. The hallway stretched before her like a corridor in a ship, all fluorescent light and echoing footsteps and the weight of institutional hierarchy pressing down like ocean depth. She had been a Master Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy. She had trained combat medics. She had outranked every person in this hospital except the hospital administrator, who didn't know that. She had seen worse than two gossips and a corrupt surgeon in a hallway at 11:27 p.m. But Whitfield was calculating, not desperate. That made him dangerous. Desperate men made mistakes. Calculating men built empires. She had 6 hours until her shift ended. 6 hours until she could return to the small apartment she shared with her 10-year-old daughter Sophia. 6 hours until she could lock the door and sit alone in her kitchen at 6 a.m. with coffee cooling in a mug and her hands finally trembling in the privacy of people who couldn't see. Katie returned to the ICU at 11:34 p.m. Captain Chen was sleeping in room 4, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man whose body was healing from violence but whose mind hadn't yet caught up with the knowledge that he'd survived. His vital signs displayed on the monitor like a musical score written in numbers: blood pressure 128/76, heart rate 68, oxygen saturation 96%. Normal. Good. The shrapnel wounds he'd sustained in the firefight at Bagram had missed anything critical by millimeters. 3 more days and he'd be transferred to a regular room. 2 weeks and he'd be discharged. Katie didn't know that his commanding officer was her son David, that the captain had personally ordered David into firefights the way officers ordered men to die, that she'd been placed in this hospital by Naval Intelligence 8 months ago to monitor someone whose name had appeared in a classified report she wasn't supposed to have read. She knew only that this man needed her, that he was in this hospital by accident and by design, that his presence here had made everything more complicated. She was adjusting his full line at 11:51 p.m. when the first tremor hit. It wasn't subtle. The building moved like a living thing, and Katie's training activated before her conscious mind could process what was happening. She reached for the monitor stand to steady it, muscle memory from a deployment to Camp Lejeune during a hurricane, from the base shake of incoming fire, from the instinct that said secure everything before gravity becomes a weapon. The tremor lasted for seconds. The fluorescent light above Captain Chen's bed swung in an arc. Then it stopped. For 3 seconds, there was silence. Katie's hand remained on the monitor stand. Her breathing remained even. Around her, the ICU froze, staff checking each other with the universal expression of people who hadn't seen an earthquake in decades and didn't believe what they just felt. Then the second wave hit, and this time the lights didn't sway. This time they snapped. The power failed at 11:49 p.m. Not gradually, completely. Every monitor darkened. Every ventilator switched to battery backup with a high-pitched alarm. The emergency lights flickered and caught, bathing the ICU in red, that specific shade of red that hospitals reserved for catastrophic failure. Around her, 8 ICU patients suddenly existed in the wrong universe. 1 was ventilator-dependent. 2 were on continuous cardiac monitoring for post-op complications. Captain Chen's chest was still knitting together, still fragile, still held together by bandages and biology and hope. The main generator should have engaged. Katie stood in the center of the ICU and waited for the familiar hum of backup power cycling through the electrical systems. The hum never came. At 11:51 p.m., Dr. Whitfield was somewhere in the hospital, probably in his office, probably reviewing the email he was composing to the hospital's board members about Katie's competency issues. At 11:52 p.m., he had no idea that the disaster he'd created through negligence was about to reveal what an actual crisis looked like, or what a woman with her hands trained through 3 combat deployments could accomplish when there was no longer any need to pretend to be anything less than what she was. At 11:53 p.m., in the darkness of the ICU, Katie Rodriguez moved toward Captain Chen's bed, and the transformation that would eventually end careers and change everything had already begun. The monitor flatlined at 11:58 p.m. Captain Marcus Chen's chest rose and fell with the mechanical ventilator, the rise and fall that kept him tethered to life in the darkness of the ICU. Then the earthquake hit like a fist from God, and the machines went silent. The ventilator wheezed once. Twice. Then nothing. Katie moved through the blackness with a penlight clenched between her teeth, its beam cutting through the chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. Around her, patients coded simultaneously across 6 beds. Monitors went dark. Alarms that had been screaming fell dead. One of the newer residents, Dr. Jennings, fumbled with equipment in the emergency lighting, his movements frantic and useless. Another stood frozen beside bed 4, staring at a patient who was no longer breathing. Manual ventilation on bed 3, Katie's voice cut through the screaming with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Someone get the crash cart from the hallway. Check airways before you check monitors. Move. The residents moved. They didn't question. That was the thing about a woman who sounded like she was giving orders in a combat zone. People listened. Dr. Morrison, the attending surgeon, scrambled toward Captain Chen's bed with his hands shaking. The earthquake had thrown medical equipment across the floor in a symphony of shattering glass and metal clattering against tile. The smell of spilled betadine and antiseptic flooded the ICU, mixing with a metallic tang of fear sweat. Morrison was a good doctor in scheduled procedures, but this was not a scheduled procedure. This was entropy and darkness and a man dying while the hospital fell apart around them. Katie reached Chen's bed and didn't hesitate. She took in the scene in a single breath, VFib on the monitor, his chest still wrapped in surgical dressings from the shrapnel wounds that had punctured his right lung 3 months ago at Bagram. The entry wound had been the size of a quarter. The exit wound had been the size of a fist. He was 23 days post-op from the surgical repair. His sternum was still healing. His ribs were still knitting. And now his heart was in VFib and the attending surgeon was standing there like a man watching his own house burn down. "We're doing an emergency thoracotomy," Katie said, already moving. Morrison's voice cracked. "You can't, that's not your scope." She was already calling for a scalpel, for betadine, for rib spreaders. The emergency kit was where it always was, where it had been in every field hospital she'd worked in, where her hands knew how to find it even in the dark. A nurse named Patricia handed her the instruments without question. There was something in Katie's voice that bypassed doubt entirely. The scalpel felt right in her hand. It always did. She made the incision between his 3rd and 4th ribs in one smooth motion, the blade sliding through skin with a kind of precision that comes from 3 deployments and 17 years of muscle memory. She didn't cut like someone learning the procedure. She cut like someone who had done it before, in places where waiting for authorization meant body bags lined up in the dust. The betadine went on. The rib spreaders came next. She positioned them and began to separate his ribs, and there was no hesitation in her movements, no moment of doubt. This was information her hands already knew. Pain was data. Procedure was survival. Everything else was noise. His ribs cracked open with a sound like a tree branch snapping in a winter forest. "You're not dying today, Captain," Katie said, her voice steady as a surgical laser as she reached inside his chest with her bare hands. The blood was warm. The muscle was still healing. His heart was a clenched fist that had forgotten how to beat. "I promised David I'd keep you safe." Morrison watched from 3 feet away, his mouth open, his hands hanging useless at his sides. This was not a nurse. This could not be a nurse. No civilian ICU nurse had ever performed an emergency thoracotomy in his unit. No nurse moved like this, like someone operating on training so deep it had become breathing. Katie began direct cardiac massage. Her hands moved inside Chen's open chest cavity, her fingers wrapping around his heart, beginning the compressions that would force blood back into circulation. 1, 2, 3. Her voice continued, calm and steady, talking him through the resuscitation like she was in a classroom instead of standing over an open chest in the dark ICU. "Come on, Captain. Come on." The heart stuttered under her hands. It was a flutter. A hesitation. A single beat that said maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done yet. "Epinephrine 1 mg 4, Katie said to Patricia, who was already drawing it. The syringe came into her line of sight and she guided it without looking, the needle going into the line while her hands continued their work inside Chen's chest. 1 more compression. 2 more. The heart stuttered again. This time it caught. "Sinus rhythm," Patricia whispered, staring at the monitor. The lights had come back on 5 minutes before, the generators kicking in with a low hum that had filled the ICU like the roar of survival itself. "We have a rhythm." Katie kept her hands moving for another 30 seconds, then slowly withdrew them. She stepped back from the bed, her scrub soaked through with Chen's blood, her hands still dripping, and there was no tremor in them. There was no hesitation. There was only the steady breathing of a woman who had just pulled a captain of the United States Navy back from the edge of death using nothing but her hands and the training that no ICU nurse in Portland was supposed to have. Morrison stood frozen against the wall, his eyes moving from Katie to Chen's open chest to the monitor showing normal sinus rhythm. His mouth moved but no words came out. Patricia was calling for surgical ICU, for blood products, for the OR staff to be ready. The ICU was coming back to life around them, ventilators humming, monitors beeping, machines remembering how to keep people alive. Katie was already moving to prepare Chen for transport. She was calling out vitals with the precision of someone reading an intelligence brief. BP 118/72 and holding. O2 sat 97%. Heart rate 88, regular. He's stable. Get him upstairs to surgical ICU. It took them 4 minutes to get Chen on the transport stretcher. It took another minute to move him out of the ICU and into the elevator that would take him to the surgical intensive care unit on the 4th floor. Katie walked beside the stretcher, her hand on Chen's shoulder, her voice low enough that only he could hear even though he was still unconscious. "You made it, sir. You made it." At 1:08 a.m., Chen was in surgical ICU with 2 units of blood being transfused, his chest closed again by a surgeon who actually looked at Katie like she might be something from a classified government file instead of something St. Michael's Hospital had hired 6 months ago. His vital signs were improving. His bleeding was controlled. His heart was beating on its own. He was alive because a quiet nurse had remembered what she was. 20 minutes later, when the chaos of the earthquake had finally settled into something that approximated order, Dr. Whitfield arrived at the ICU. He walked through the double doors in his perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair immaculate, his expression already arranged into one of those practiced looks of administrative concern. He moved toward Katie with the kind of smile that belonged to a man who controlled hospital politics the way other men controlled chessboards. Then he saw Chen's bed. He saw the empty spot where a patient in VFib should have been. He saw Katie standing nearby, her scrub soaked with blood, her hands trembling not from fear but from adrenaline, from the specific shaking that comes only after you've held a man's heart in your palm and felt it beat back to life. He saw Dr. Morrison standing against the wall looking like someone who had just witnessed something that didn't fit into any category he understood. Whitfield's expression changed. The smile died. His eyes moved from Katie to the empty bed to Morrison and back again. For just a moment, just a single moment, his face showed exactly what he was thinking. This woman just did something I didn't know was possible. This woman just revealed capabilities that no civilian nurse should possess. This woman is not what she appears to be. And then his expression hardened into something else entirely. He turned and walked out of the ICU without saying a word. But that wasn't the last time Katie would see him today. Dr. Whitfield's office door closed with a soft click at 2:15 a.m., but Katie was already 3 floors above him, watching Captain Chen's chest rise and fall in the surgical ICU. The thoracotomy incision had been closed with meticulous precision. Direct cardiac massage had restored his rhythm at exactly 11:58 p.m., 11 minutes after her hands cracked his sternum open. Sinus rhythm maintained. Blood pressure climbing. O2 saturation stable at 94%. The man was alive because she hadn't hesitated, because muscle memory from Bagram had overridden every civilian protocol screaming at her to wait, to defer, to let someone else decide. Chen's eyes were closed. Medicated. Safe. And somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Whitfield was already making phone calls. She didn't know the exact words yet, but she knew the pattern. She'd watched men like him operate for 18 years, men who could transform a life saved into a liability, a procedure into a violation, a hero into a problem. The fluorescent lights above Chen's bed buzzed with their mechanical rhythm, and Katie checked his full lines one more time. The dressing was clean. Stable. Her hands remained absolutely steady. They always did. The trembling, if it ever came, waited for darkness and closed doors. By 6 a.m., the investigation had begun. Katie knew this because she watched people's faces change when they looked at her in the hallway. Margaret from the night shift wouldn't make eye contact. Susan, who'd mocked her at the vending machine 3 days ago, suddenly became very interested in her tablet. The residents who'd stood silent during grand rounds now whispered when she passed. She'd heard the phrase before she saw the investigator, State Nursing Board. Credentials review. Scope violation. The words moved through St. Michael's like a virus, and with each repetition, her cover fractured a little more. The investigator was a thin woman named Dr. Patricia Moss, all sharp angles and clipboard efficiency. Katie watched her emerge from Whitfield's office at 6:11 a.m., already holding a stack of personnel files. Already asking questions. Already knowing exactly what Whitfield wanted her to find. The cover identities would hold. Naval intelligence had constructed them too carefully for a simple phone call to unravel, but the damage was already done. An outside investigator meant pressure. Pressure meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant someone would eventually ask the right questions, and when they did, Katie's 10-year mission inside St. Michael's Hospital would be finished. She was moving through the medication room at 7:15 a.m., restocking the crash cart with its neat rows of syringes and vials, when Whitfield's voice cut through the intercom. Nurse Rodriguez, report to my office immediately. No title. No, please. Just the command, delivered with the certainty of a man who'd already decided what she was and what she'd done. Katie finished counting the last of the epinephrine doses, 5 1-milligram ampules in the crash cart, and then turned toward his office. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been. Rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere outside, Portland was waking up to the earthquake's aftermath, and inside St. Michael's Hospital, one nurse was walking toward her own destruction. Whitfield's office smelled like expensive coffee and expensive rage. He didn't invite her to sit. He didn't offer pleasantries. He simply slid a folder across his mahogany desk with the precision of a man dealing cards, and when he spoke, his voice was the controlled calm of someone who'd practiced this moment in his mind 1,000 times. I've reviewed your actions during last night's emergency with our legal counsel and with the outside investigator now reviewing your credentials. What you performed was not a nurse's function. It was surgery. Unauthorized surgery. On a patient you had no right to touch beyond basic ICU protocols. Katie opened the folder. She read every word. Practicing beyond scope of practice. Failure to follow chain of command. Creating institutional liability through unauthorized decision-making. The charges were precise, professional, and completely constructed. There wasn't a single inaccuracy, because Whitfield was smart enough not to lie. He'd simply reframed the truth. She had performed a thoracotomy. She had made a decision without waiting for authorization. She had, by any civilian standard, violated approximately 47 hospital policies. What he didn't mention was that Captain Chen would be dead if she hadn't. You performed direct cardiac massage through an open chest cavity with no formal surgical training on your record, Whitfield continued. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, dangerous, barely restrained. You opened a patient's chest without a surgeon present. Without authorization. Without even waiting for Dr. Hartley to arrive from the emergency department. This is the kind of cowboy behavior that your performance reviews have consistently warned about. Katie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Captain Chen was in VFib. His heart was not beating. The attending surgeon froze. No one was moving. So I moved. That's not your determination to make. Whitfield leaned forward across the desk. His eyes were the color of cold slate. You're a nurse, Katie. Not a surgeon. Not a physician. A nurse. Your job is to assist, to defer to medical authority, to follow protocol. Not to become the authority. Not to override the chain of command because you think you're smarter than the system. The words were designed to land precisely where they could do the most damage, on the part of her that had learned to carry the weight of command decisions, to own the consequences of her actions, to trust her own judgment because lives depended on it. Whitfield was trying to plant shame in that ground, and what he didn't understand was that the soil had already been salted by 18 years of service. By commanding a 4-person surgical team in a FOB with incoming mortars. By deciding which 17 patients could be moved and which 2 had to stay behind. By being right and being wrong, and learning that the difference between those 2 things was sometimes just a matter of whose judgment you trusted. She signed the disciplinary paperwork at 8:03 a.m. Her signature was steady. 1 line under her name, acknowledging receipt of formal charges. When Whitfield asked if she had anything to say, Katie met his eyes with absolute composure and spoke in a voice that had dropped an octave. Captain Chen would be dead if I had waited for authorization. Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's not your determination to make. You're restricted from patient care effective immediately. Consider yourself suspended pending the conclusion of this investigation. You'll be notified in writing of the formal hearing within 72 hours. Security will escort you from the building by 2 p.m. Clear your locker. The words were delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made Katie's hands finally want to shake when she was alone in the employee locker room at 1:08 p.m., watching hospital security stand in the doorway while she cleared out 8 months of her cover life into a cardboard box. What made it worst was knowing that Whitfield had already won before she'd even cracked Chen's chest open. Her cover was burned. Her mission was compromised. And every second she'd spent saving Captain Chen's life was a second she'd spent destroying her ability to be the asset naval intelligence had placed here to monitor him. The locker was mostly empty now. A spare set of scrubs. Her employee handbook. A fleece jacket she'd worn once. And underneath the jacket, at the very bottom, a pair of worn combat boots she'd stupidly kept, her own boots, from Kandahar, from 3 deployments, from a lifetime she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. She grabbed them quickly and stuffed them into the box. The security guard didn't seem to notice. He was too busy looking at his phone, counting down the minutes until he could clock out and go home, unaware that he was escorting a Master Chief Petty Officer out of the building like she was a thief. Her badge was confiscated at the security desk. The plastic one with her photograph and her civilian name and the date when she'd begun her 10-year infiltration. The officer running the scanner, a man named Torres who'd always been kind to her, who'd once helped her carry supplies to a patient's room, didn't meet her eyes. He knew she was being removed. He didn't know why, but he knew that whatever had happened during the night shift, whatever she'd done, it was bad enough that Dr. Whitfield wanted her gone. Her access card was deactivated with a single keystroke. Katie watched the badge reader light up red when Torres tried to swipe her card through, testing it. Red light. Access denied. You do not belong here. She walked through the lobby at 2:03 p.m., the cardboard box in her arms, past the waiting area where families sat in clusters, past the information desk where volunteers directed patients toward elevators, past the nurses' station where Margaret and Susan actually made eye contact this time. Their expressions were a mixture of vindication and something that might have been guilt. They'd mocked her at the vending machine. They'd questioned whether she had the spine for emergency medicine. They'd been right about her not belonging, they thought. They'd been right all along. What they didn't understand was that Katie had never been spine deficient. She'd just been buried under 18 years of protocol and humility and the careful invisibility required to move through an institution without being seen. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for her departure. Portland's sky was bruised purple and grey, the aftermath of the earthquake still settling over the city like ash. Katie placed the cardboard box in the trunk of her 2019 Honda Civic, a civilian car for a civilian cover, and closed the lid on 8 months of work. On the boots from Bagram. On the mission that had been the most important of her career because it wasn't about a target or an operation or a piece of intelligence. It was about keeping her son's commanding officer alive. And she had. She'd saved Captain Chen's life with her hands and her training and her willingness to step outside the protocol that was supposed to contain her, and in doing so, she destroyed the asset naval intelligence had built. She didn't cry on the drive home. The Master Chief Petty Officer didn't cry at traffic lights or in parking lots or while sitting in rush-hour traffic on Highway 26. That was a luxury for people who hadn't learned that tears were a liability, that emotion was a weakness that could be exploited, that the only acceptable response to devastation was to breathe through it and keep moving. So she kept moving. Out of the parking lot. Through the city. Away from St. Michael's Hospital, from Dr. Whitfield's cold slate eyes, from the investigation that would eventually conclude that she'd violated protocol but saved a life, and if there was any justice in the system, that would be enough. But justice and systems didn't always align. Katie knew this from experience. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated at 2:24 p.m. on a rainy Portland afternoon as she drove toward her small house and her 10-year-old daughter and the moment when she would have to explain why she was home in the middle of the day when she was supposed to be at work, was that in exactly 24 hours, a Navy helicopter would land in St. Michael's parking lot, and 3 military vehicles would form a convoy at the main entrance, and Captain Marcus Chen himself would walk into a conference room on crutches with bandages still visible through his shirt, and say 3 words that would change everything: "Where is Sandpiper?" The apartment was so quiet Katie could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. 3:30 in the afternoon. She sat at the table in her scrubs still, the same scrubs she'd been wearing when she cracked Captain Chen's chest, the same scrubs still faintly stained at the cuff with his blood. Her hands rested flat on the table in front of her. They were shaking. After 6 hours of surgical precision, of holding Chen's heart in her palms and feeling it restart under her fingers, of speaking in calm measured tones while her entire operational cover disintegrated around her, her hands were finally shaking. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She'd held it together through the arrest, through Whitfield's escalation, through security walking her out of the building with her badge confiscated. She'd held it together in the car, on the drive home, up the stairs to her apartment on the 3rd floor of a quiet complex in northeast Portland. Now, alone, her hands betrayed her. She stared at the kitchen wall. A calendar hung there from 2 years ago, she kept forgetting to take it down. July 2021. A month before David deployed. Before everything changed. Before she'd volunteered for this. The wall didn't have answers. The wall just sat there, beige and indifferent, while her entire life reorganized itself into pieces she couldn't put back together. Sophia's key turned in the lock at 4:15. 4th grade dismissal was at 3:40. The bus ride home took 25 minutes if traffic on Burnside was light. Katie heard her daughter's backpack hit the floor, heard the small wheeze of the door closing. Heard the moment Sophia's footsteps stopped. "Mommy." Her voice was small, confused. Why are you home? Did something bad happen? Katie looked at her 10-year-old standing in the kitchen doorway like she'd just stepped into a room where the air had changed pressure. Sophia's uniform jumper was still neat from morning. Her dark hair was tied with the blue ribbon Katie had braided in before work. Her lunchbox was clutched in one hand, and her eyes, David's eyes, the same exact shape and color, were searching her mother's face for clues about what kind of bad thing required a parent to be home before dinner. She wanted to tell her. She wanted to say that her mother wasn't actually a nurse, that she'd spent the last 6 months pretending to be someone she wasn't, that everything she'd been doing had been operational, that saving Captain Chen's life had been necessary but that necessity had destroyed everything she'd built. She wanted to explain classified operations to a 10-year-old. She wanted to use words like cover and compromised and make Sophia understand that sometimes being good at your job meant losing your job. Instead, Katie cleared her throat and tried to smile. I had to leave work early, baby. Come here. Sophia dropped her lunchbox and came running. She climbed into Katie's lap like she hadn't done since she was 7 years old, wrapping her small arms around her mother's neck. Her backpack straps dug into Katie's ribs. She smelled like the antiseptic hand sanitizer from school and the apple juice box she'd drunk at lunch and everything that was innocent and uncomplicated about childhood. Katie held her daughter against her chest and let herself break. Not in front of the hospital. Not in front of security. Not in front of Dr. Whitfield or the investigator or the board of directors. Here. Alone. With her daughter's arms around her neck and the wall calendar showing a month that didn't exist anymore. She let her hands shake. She let her shoulders move. She let the sound come out, not loud, not dramatic, just the honest sound of a woman whose mission was compromised and whose daughter was asking why the rules had changed. It's okay, Mom, Sophia said quietly, the way children do when they're trying to be strong for adults. Whatever it is, we can fix it. Katie held on to that statement for 5 minutes. She held on like it was true. Like broken covers could be repaired. Like operational failures could be explained away. Like there was any way to fix the fact that she'd revealed Master Chief Petty Officer capabilities in a civilian hospital and that every Navy intelligence asset depending on her deep placement had just become exposed. At 5:40, after Sophia had moved through the apartment doing homework at the kitchen table while Katie made dinner neither of them would eat, Katie's secure phone vibrated against the counter. Not her regular phone. The encrypted device. The one with the direct line to her handler at Naval Station Everett. The message was 2 words, extraction suspended. She stared at it. Not the normal codes. Not her call sign. Not the protocol structure. Just 2 words and a period, like someone typing through gritted teeth. Extraction suspended meant her exit plan was on hold. Extraction suspended meant she was being left in place. Left in place with her cover destroyed and her capacity exposed and no way to explain any of it to the daughter doing fractions at her kitchen table. She set the phone down and poured coffee. It was cold by the time she'd finished the cup. Down at St. Michael's, in the conference room on the 4th floor, Dr. Whitfield was teaching a room full of terrified administrators how perfectly he'd executed a threat elimination. The board of directors sat arranged around a mahogany table like a jury. Whitfield stood at the head with his posture pulled straight, the posture of a man who believed he'd won. The investigator's report confirms what I've been documenting for weeks, Whitfield said, sliding papers across the table. His voice carried the smooth confidence of institutional power. Inconsistencies in her credentials. References that don't align. Scope of practice violations. Most critically, she performed an emergency thoracotomy on a patient without proper authorization. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's criminally negligent endangerment. He smiled. Not warmly. The smile like a wolf showing its teeth, brief and all teeth and no warmth. I'm recommending immediate termination with cause. No severance. No references. The hospital's legal position is airtight. The board members exchanged glances. One of them, Janet Kressler, Chief Financial Officer, leaned forward. The patient survived, though. Captain Chen. He's stable in the ICU. By all accounts, she saved his life. Whitfield's jaw tightened. That's not the point. The point is protocol violation. The point is she demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that should concern us about how she obtained her credentials in the first place. Better to address this now before it becomes a liability for the hospital. The room accepted this. Institutional self-protection always sounded reasonable when the alternative was admitting you'd hired someone dangerous. By the time Whitfield left the meeting, formal disciplinary proceedings were scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. He had her. The problem was being eliminated. By tomorrow afternoon, Katie Rodriguez would be a terminated employee with a disciplinary file that would follow her to every hospital in Oregon. Whatever her real credentials were, and Whitfield had decided not to look too closely at whether the naval intelligence angle was actual fact or his own paranoia, she would never work in healthcare again. What Whitfield didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated because he was thinking in hospital terms instead of military terms, was that Captain Marcus Chen had regained full consciousness at 2 o'clock that afternoon. The anesthesia had burned off. His pupils had constricted to normal. His eyes had opened to the ICU ceiling and the sound of ventilators and monitors, and the first thing he'd done was try to sit up, which had caused his surgical incisions to scream, which had brought a nurse running. "Easy, sir. You need to stay still," the nurse had said. But Chen had grabbed her wrist with the strength of a man operating on pure instinct. "The woman who saved my life. The one who did the surgery. Where is she?" The nurse had hesitated. I think she's on break, Captain." He'd let go of her wrist and asked her to check. To find out. To get him answers. By 2:45, he had those answers. Master Chief Rodriguez was no longer an employee. She'd been escorted from the building at 2 o'clock. Her badge access had been revoked. Her status in the hospital system had been changed to separated cause. Chen had stared at the hospital ceiling and felt something clarify in his chest. Something that had nothing to do with his injuries. Something colder and more focused than pain. Then he'd reached for the secure phone the Navy had provided and made a single call to Naval Station Everett. The conversation had lasted 90 seconds. By 3:15 that Friday morning, orders had been signed by officers Katie didn't know and would never meet. The helicopter was being staged. The Master Sergeant was being mobilized. The Judge Advocate General was pulling files. By 3:30, the officers were coordinating what would happen in the conference room in 6.5 hours. By 4, the news networks were getting their alerts. The earthquake hero story was circulating. The public loved stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They were about to love this one. And Katie Rodriguez, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands finally steady again because there was nothing left to protect, was folding a pair of worn combat boots in her bedroom closet. The boots were 17 years old. They'd been to Kandahar twice and Jalalabad once and Helmand Province for 60 days of operations that officially didn't happen. The boots had carried her through things her daughter would never need to know existed. She set them on the shelf beside her dress uniform, still in its hanging bag, and closed the closet door. Tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same. But tonight, her daughter was asleep in the next room. Tonight, Katie had time to sit in the dark and remember how to be a Master Chief Petty Officer again. Tonight, she could let herself remember that some things, once revealed, couldn't be hidden anymore. Some covers, once broken, couldn't be repaired. Some truths, once in the air, had to be faced. The rotor blades thundered overhead at 2:41 p.m. the next afternoon, and through her apartment window Katie watched the Navy helicopter descend toward St. Michael's parking lot like a falcon dropping from the sky. The sound was unmistakable, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of a UH-60M Black Hawk, the kind that had carried her out of Bagram more than a decade ago. 3 military vehicles formed a tight convoy at the main entrance below, their engines idling with the kind of patient menace that came from men who knew how to wait. Katie's hands didn't shake as she watched. They never did. Not anymore. Not since Kandahar had taught her that trembling was a luxury for people who got to choose when their lives fell apart. She didn't move from the window. She simply watched as a Navy Master Sergeant emerged from the lead vehicle, his dress uniform crisp enough to cut glass, his bearing the kind that made civilians instinctively step backward. He moved through the main entrance with the kind of purposeful stride that didn't ask permission. 3 federal agents in dark suits followed behind him, their faces carrying the blank expression of people who had already won the conversation before it started. In the hospital's main conference room on the 3rd floor, Dr. Whitfield sat at the head of a polished oak table with the board of directors arranged around him like chess pieces he'd already positioned for checkmate. Margaret Chen, no relation to Captain Chen, adjusted the folder in front of her containing Katie's fabricated disciplinary file. Susan Hartley, the hospital's chief administrator, had her fingers steepled beneath her chin, preparing to deliver the final judgment. Whitfield had been rehearsing this moment for 16 hours, his voice smooth as silk and twice as sharp. He was about to speak when the conference room door opened without a knock. "I'm here for Sandpiper," the Master Sergeant said. Not a request. A statement. His uniform carried insignia Katie had seen only once before, a Naval Intelligence Directorate. The room's air pressure changed. The veteran security guard standing by the wall went pale. His hand moved automatically to his chest in a half-salute before he caught himself, muscle memory from service days bleeding through his civilian job like blood through gauze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Whitfield's smile froze on his face, still arranged for the kill, but the light behind his eyes flickered. "I'm sorry, we're in a closed administrative meeting. You'll need to schedule." "Captain Marcus Chen will be here in 60 seconds, the Master Sergeant interrupted. "He's walking from the vehicle now. Your cooperation would be appreciated, Dr. Whitfield. Your silence would be noted." The words hung in the conference room like shrapnel, sharp and impossible to ignore. Margaret Chen felt her throat tighten. Susan's fingers unclenched. One of the board members stood up, then sat back down, unsure if standing in the presence of naval intelligence was more or less disrespectful than sitting. 45 seconds later, the door opened again. Captain Marcus Chen walked in on crutches, his dress uniform impeccable, his chest still bandaged beneath the jacket, moving with the kind of careful precision that came from healing through determination rather than comfort. His eye swept the room, taking in the setup, and when his gaze landed on Whitfield, something ancient and patient settled into his expression. "Dr. Whitfield," Chen said, his voice level as a carpenter's line. "You've built quite a case against Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez." The words hit the room like a frag grenade. Master Chief. Not nurse. Not consultant. Master Chief. "Captain," Whitfield said, recovering slightly, "I don't believe you understand the scope of this hospital's administrative. I understand that 3 days ago, this woman performed an emergency thoracotomy in a blackout using a stainless steel trauma tray and direct cardiac massage with her hands." Chen continued as if Whitfield hadn't spoken. "I understand that she kept me alive through a procedure that required training most surgeons don't have, all while you were 6 minutes away watching the show on your security monitor." The silence in the room was so thick you could operate in it. "Master Chief Rodriguez has earned 3 Navy Crosses," Chen said, his voice dropping another octave, a voice like a tank engine idling in a quiet garage. "She's trained half the combat medics currently deployed in the Middle East. She once held together a 19-year-old sailor's severed femoral artery for 40 minutes under enemy fire at Bagram Airfield until evac arrived. 40 minutes. Her hands bleeding through 2 pairs of gloves. That sailor is alive today because Master Chief Rodriguez refused to let him die." Margaret Chen felt tears start without permission. Susan's jaw was open just wide enough to be visible if anyone was looking, which they weren't because everyone was staring at Katie's empty chair and understanding what had been sitting across from them in scrubs for 6 months. The conference room door opened a 3rd time. A woman in a Navy service dress uniform with the insignia of Judge Advocate General stepped inside, carrying a leather portfolio that seemed to weigh about 3,000 pounds. Behind her came 2 men in Federal Bureau of Investigation windbreakers. The air in the room shifted from shock to something else, something colder, something that tasted like the end of things. Dr. Richard Whitfield, the JAG officer said, her voice carrying the kind of official weight that made corporate lawyers nervous. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, in conjunction with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Oregon, is initiating a criminal investigation into St. Michael's Hospital billing practices dating back 18 months. Specifically, we're examining the charges you authorized for equipment purchases that were never delivered, surgical procedures that never occurred, and pharmaceutical allocations that were diverted to private medical practices in which you hold a financial interest. She opened the portfolio. Medical billing records spilled out like evidence at a crime scene. Invoices. Purchase orders. Bank records. Photographs of equipment receipts where the serial numbers had been altered. The total amount of fraudulent charges totals $847,000 in federal healthcare fraud, the JAG officer continued. An additional $340,000 in kickbacks to your personal accounts from medical equipment suppliers. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately pending criminal proceedings. Dr. Whitfield, you are being asked to surrender to federal custody for processing. Your attorney will be contacted within the hour. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent witnesses to the collapse of empire. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old milk. His hands, which had held a scalpel with such confidence 3 days ago, were now shaking in a way that couldn't be hidden. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His lawyer, who'd been sitting quietly at the end of the table, was already standing and pulling out his phone. This is insane, Whitfield said, but his voice had changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by something smaller, something desperate and fragile as blown glass. You have no idea what you're doing. I have relationships with the Board of Trustees. I have contacts at the State Medical Board. Sir, I need you to stand up slowly, one of the FBI agents said. Not unkindly. Just professionally. 2 federal agents escorted Dr. Richard Whitfield from the conference room while news cameras that had positioned themselves outside the hospital's main entrance captured every moment. His face half covered by his hand, his gait that of a man moving through water, his career falling away with each step like snow in spring. The security guard who'd snapped to attention for the master sergeant watched him pass and said nothing. Margaret Chen's tears were flowing freely now, though whether for her own complicity or for Katie's vindication, nobody could have said. Captain Chen remained in the conference room with the JAG officer, answering questions about the emergency thoracotomy, confirming every detail of Katie's life-saving actions. The master sergeant stood by the window watching the news vans multiply like a virus in the parking lot below. Through the glass, the camera operators were already setting up. Navy hero nurse uncovered hospital fraud while saving captain's life, the crawl would read. The irony that Katie had been investigating Whitfield the entire time, finally breaking the surface like a whale coming up for air. Outside, Katie sat in a Navy vehicle with tinted windows, still in civilian clothes, jeans and a grey sweater, nothing that hinted at the uniform waiting in her apartment closet. Captain Chen slid into the seat beside her at 3:16 p.m., his uniform still immaculate, his breathing carefully controlled from the walk and the effort of standing. David talks about you constantly, Chen said without preamble. He doesn't know you were watching over me. He doesn't know his mother was here the entire time. Katie's voice was quiet, measured, the voice of someone who'd learned patience in places where impatience meant death. He can't know. Not yet. The JAG officer is briefing the FBI now, Chen continued. The fraud investigation will proceed without requiring your testimony in open court. Your cover can be partially maintained. For David's sake. For your daughter's sake. Katie nodded slowly, watching through the tinted windows as her former workplace descended into organized chaos. FBI agents were already requesting server access. Hospital security was being escorted away from sensitive areas. The board of directors was requesting individual legal counsel. The beautiful machine of institutional accountability was grinding to life, and Dr. Richard Whitfield was caught in its gears. Thank you, Katie said, and Chen understood she wasn't thanking him for the recognition or the rescue. She was thanking him for understanding that some heroism had to stay buried for people you loved more than you loved being known. The JAG officer briefed her by secure phone 2 hours later. Whitfield had retained counsel and was negotiating surrender terms. The preliminary investigation showed 18 months of systematic fraud. Multiple other surgeons at St. Michael's were being questioned about their knowledge of billing irregularities. Katie's intelligence work remained classified, her true purpose unreportable in any civilian proceeding. 3 weeks later, federal prosecutors would announce charges: wire fraud, healthcare fraud, theft of government funds, conspiracy. Whitfield's medical license was suspended pending criminal proceedings. 6 months after the earthquake, Dr. Richard Whitfield pleaded guilty to avoid trial. The sentencing hearing was brief. The judge didn't look impressed. 18 months imprisonment. Restitution to the Department of Defense. A lifetime bar from practicing medicine in any U.S. jurisdiction. But what nobody knew, what wouldn't appear in the news reports or the court documents, was that someone spotted Dr. Whitfield teaching CPR certification courses at Portland Community College 18 months later. His hands were steadier now, somewhat, though they still carried a faint tremor when he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy. His voice had lost its edge, his posture had curved inward, his bearing had contracted from DR to just another instructor at minimum wage. The students didn't know his name. They didn't know he'd once been chief of surgery at one of the city's premier hospitals. They didn't know his career had ended in federal court. He was invisible now, exactly the way he'd tried to make Katie invisible, and the irony was so perfect it could have been designed by poets. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment below with your thoughts. What would you have done in Katie's position? Has someone ever underestimated you the way the hospital underestimated her? I'd love to hear your stories.